Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Ryan Reynolds film Buried. This, of course, is a 2010 film that really I would say, honestly, this is probably my favorite Ryan Reynolds film, probably out of all the ones that he's ever done. And I can understand a lot of people loving certain things like Deadpool, maybe Green Lantern, Just Friends, any number of things that Ryan Reynolds has done, but I think this one really is just my favorite. Yeah, people could probably have a problem with this movie, mostly being in the darkness, where the movie might be too dark for some people, or at some points in time, people could probably complain that you don't see every single ditch second of what goes on in this movie, or whichever. Here's also the kind of the funny thing when all of a sudden people are to eventually talk about this movie. Eventually, all of a sudden, they end up becoming buried alive experts, and all of a sudden, everybody's just like, "Well, yeah, like all you have to do is just kind of like go and just do this one thing, and you'll be like you'll be in the clear." And you should be able to easily get out of this coffin, and you'll be up to the surface within mere minutes or whatever. If supposedly you're kind of XYZ underground and whatever, and so you should easily be able to do this, right? Uh, you also have so many kind of buried alive kind of movies or kind of things where eventually that's to be a small portion of some film somewhere. Like, of course, we end up having like the Kill Bill movie eventually when Uma Thurman is to be buried alive and she is to have to like freaking punch her way through her coffin to try to break through and make it out of her coffin at some point. Uh, we also end up having a 1990 film called Buried Alive, which uh, I think eventually did have some kind of franchise along with it, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But I do remember like seeing bits and pieces of it. I'm like, but I think like those like coffins were actually like legitimate like coffins, but I don't think it was so easy for any of these characters to have eventually gotten out for one reason or another. Um, we also end up in a animated way of doing things. We also had the Justice League Doom movie, where of course Bruce Wayne, Batman, was of course to have gotten buried alive with his parents. And so we end up having Bruce who takes his keys and wraps it around his fingers and goes and smashes through his coffin, just like what Kill Bill had done in other movie. So I guess it seems to be weirdly that seems to be the technique, just kind of punch your coffin until it just gives way, and then you could just easily just like, oh yeah, I can just easily break through this thing. Like, I would definitely not be going and trying to smash through my coffin through the front of it. Like, you would think then, like, basically every move that you are to make with your coffin, like reasonably, you would just be eventually having all this dirt and dust and whatever be flung upon you. And so now you're having to, like, if you aren't smart about it, like you're gonna have like a difficult time like seeing your way out and whatever what have you. Plus it just would make a difficult way of just like, I don't know if I could really rationalize kind of punching from the very top and then kind of climbing your way out. That just seems kind of weird to me. But again, I am not a buried alive expert. So going on into this film, we have Paul's character who is to, of course, be buried alive, and supposedly, from what I read somewhere, it seemed that Ryan Reynolds may or may not have been claustrophobic during this film. So I'm like, holy crap. Could you imagine Ari technically having this fear and being claustrophobic and you're having to like deal with this in this environment, which yeah, you could say, like, because how they kind of shot this film, because I watched the behind the scenes of this, like, we have parts that are to kind of open in certain places of the coffin, to eventually have them be able to kind of shoot Ryan from certain kind of angles. When eventually you can kind of see them kind of slowly but surely pan around, that's when they open up certain kind of slits in the coffin to eventually continue to try to shoot as Ryan is to do certain activities and certain things through this coffin. I would honestly have to have assessed or assumed at some point that the coffin would have had to have adjusted for certain scenes, especially where Ryan is to have to kind of like flip his body from one part of the coffin to the other. Like, I'm just like, okay, how would they have been able to have Ryan just kind of squeak his body through there? That seems like really difficult. Um, but like, here's always the kind of funny thing also, when you have people that are to like kind of all of a sudden be these kind of like expert people, uh because this is a movie, like this isn't a real life scenario where like, yeah, I think that like if you have a cell phone they should easily been able to track your number, and like everything should go out without a hitch, and like and everything would have perfectly and easily worked out, uh because like unless you're like a phone technology expert of sorts, then like more than likely, I don't know how many times you could probably lose any number of signal through like conveniently any parts of film where like phone signals don't usually work in movie scenarios, and or are weak and whatever. Plus, like, we only get to know that the dirt is to be kind of compact onto Ryan. What if he was? What if they just pour cement over his coffin? Like, yeah, he probably wouldn't be getting out of that. What if the dirt was to be a certain kind of dirt, which wouldn't be so easily for Ryan to get out of, and so on and so forth? Like, there could be a number of certain weather conditions, and plus we also don't know what other certain kind of things that they had put in place for Ryan to have, if he was to try to get out of here. Maybe they had landmines in this burial. We don't know. Like, that's what kind of makes it to just be like, well, maybe that's the reason why Ryan did stay, because maybe there's all of a sudden to be some kind of uh, trap lined somewhere around Ryan is burial place to have certain things go off if Ryan is to try to make his way out. Like, that's the whole like that's there's a whole factor of that where there might be like uh motion mines or something like that if Ryan is to try to dig his way out. We don't know. That would be horrific. So like, be afraid of the unknown, and I think Ryan's character Paul is to just kind of fear the unknown, and that is the way that he had desperately tried to stay in his coffin for as long as humanly possible, even though obviously he's running out of air. Like, he didn't understand or know the technique that you could probably put your shirt over your head and then seemingly have a certain kind of supply, extra supply of air to then go bash through his coffin and create this opening for Ryan to eventually go and crawl out of his coffin. Like, he probably didn't see YouTube videos of how to unbury alive himself. He didn't probably go and search this, like, because not all these things were readily available like they probably much more are now, because we have this movie to just kind of speculate what we would have done. So, going into this film, uh, really just this movie is to also give us the thing of Ryan eventually possibly succeeding and eventually getting out of this alive or eventually dying. Um, and basically, there are to be also other factors during this film which Ryan has to deal with, and people that eventually he has to call because he is to eventually, luckily enough, find a phone on him. And we end up having people who are like, oh man, if he has a phone, like they should have easily found him, they should have easily got to him. And I don't know about that, but like, okay, sure. Like everybody thinks that everything is to be just so easy. When they go through this movie and they kind of like contradict it and whatever. But yeah, like I just take it from the aspect of like I'm sure a lot of people would have like been uh like in Ryan's shoes, they would have probably played this thing out the exact same way. I just would have liked for maybe Paul to have eventually told people right away that he is to be buried alive quickly, so that way he can be like, dude, I'm buried alive. I'm probably only gonna have like a couple hours worth of air here. And I think that's what he should have really started out every conversation, because a lot of times he ends up kind of uh, like eventually like uh, kind of telling the people, kind of being like upset or being angry with the people, and then it's like, well, why should I help you? But then also, it seems that every single time Ryan is to also call every single new person, he is to basically tell them their whole life story, or his whole life story, and of how he got here. And I'm like, dude, that is wasting so much time where he has to go and re explain all of this to all of these people. And I'm just like, good God, like this guy only has probably what, like 3 to 5 hours worth of real legitimate air, to where we also have Ryan who is lighting a match as you, or lighting a lighter as you see here, which is also going to probably consume some oxygen as well. And so, but again, I'm sure people will be like, well, hey, he did have those, uh, like he did have a crappy flashlight. He did have those green glow sticky things that eventually he ends up going and breaking one of them during a fire. Because yeah, like he ended up having to light up his coffin at some point forcibly because there was uh, something that was to eventually go and come after Ryan at some point in this movie. So going into this film, no matter how dark this was, no matter how like really you couldn't see much, you could still invest in this character and hope that eventually Ryan's character could have gotten free. That eventually he could have figured out some way to have either, because he couldn't rely on other people, that maybe Paul could have eventually figured out some way to rely on himself. Because it seems that everywhere he was turned, people were pretty much telling him that, like, well, hey, like, we're just gonna have to, like, just have you just, like, we're basically just gonna listen to you die, pretty much is what's happening with this character. And so like that's kind of the heartbreaking thing of eventually having this possibility that you're to pretty much listen to someone die. So with that said, I think I'm going to go into spoiler territory, because I've almost got into a close kind of aspect of like whether Ryan makes it out or not. Uh, or I've probably almost given that away. So I think it's that customary time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of the film, we are to have, of course, Ryan who is waking up in this coffin. Like interestingly enough, like again, I was seeing the kind of the behind the scenes of this movie, and I heard that every single thing that Ryan was hearing from this phone that he was to be on was coming from one person, and then eventually, I guess, edited later, they ended up having a number of other people doing whatever the lines were for this film. And I was like, wouldn't they have gone and done the voice parts first and then that seems kind of like in anime, where eventually you would think like the voices would come first, and then they would do the movie. Uh, but I guess maybe they wanted like Ryan Reynolds' performance to be the most important thing, and then all the other voices can come secondary. I don't know, but anyways, or maybe like I think a lot of the people were like, "Hey, don't ad lib any lines. Just kind of perfectly, just say like what we're saying here." Because if you're gonna do anything else, you're probably gonna mess up this film. So, uh, I don't know. They could have probably ad libbed. Anyways, pushing on. So Ryan has to wake up to, of course, eventually. I think the first early thing that he ends up finding is this phone, and he ends up finding this stranger's phone, and so he is to be in Baghdad, somewhere in the Bakuba province, somewhere in there. He ends up saying that a lot. So really the one thing that Paul's character doesn't have is supposedly his company's CRTs. Yes, I figured that out. Luckily, Paul is to not have this ability to have figured out his company's security line in case like there are some problems that are to happen. Paul doesn't have conveniently a number to get to this company. And so the first thing that he ends up trying to do is he ends up just is to try to call 911 in this location. And so all of a sudden Ryan is calling 911 and he ends up getting to this 911 operator, and he is to just kind of tell them what's going on, tell them that he's buried alive, and eventually this woman is like, okay, where are you buried at? Where are you buried like currently? And he's like, I don't know, somewhere in Iraq and the Bakiba like province and this and that. And so the woman is like, well, like here's the thing, like you're calling a 911 operator that's from the United States, and Paul is just like, oh my god, like so like eventually like Paul is to have this woman mention that like, well, I can go and I can transfer you to my sheriff, and like he'll have to figure things out, and Paul is like, don't bother, and he ends up hanging up because he's just like so he had to tell this woman this story that basically he is a truck driver, and he went over there to eventually give these people supplies, and in return like there was kids who end up throwing rocks at him, and eventually there had been this supposedly uh, terrorist force of some kind that was to go and shoot at Ryan in the military force that Ryan was to be with, and supposedly Paul was to be told uh, by his company that they were to supposedly have bulletproof windows and armored parts of their vehicles, which I guess was a complete and utter lie. And so Ryan is to now just go and randomly call like I guess this operator to try to transfer him to the FBI. And so Paul is to go and call the FBI, and so we have this FBI agent who is to be Special Agent Harris, who is to talk to Ryan, and like Ryan again is just kind of very hysterical, and like a lot of people I think have the criticism that Ryan is like, of course, not being too calm in this scenario, like, how would you react? Like being buried alive and also having Paul's character, who is to be taking anxiety medication. You would have thought that this guy probably, when waking up, the first thing that he probably would have had was a heart attack or a panic attack or whichever. Like you don't know like the mental behavior of this character, and but also just like this guy is probably just like, I am going to die. Like I don't think there's going to be any way for anyone to have actually helped me, and so you end up having like Paul's character just panicking so badly, and I just feel so sad for him. So Paul goes on and talks to Special Agent Harris and is to mention this whole entire story of which that I've technically just said to this special agent. And so eventually Ryan is to also start losing signal. It seems that there is a point when his signal is to start to drop off. We also have at some point where Ryan is to also go and have to write, because luckily he has a pencil on him. He also has a flask on him that has alcohol in it, and he has his anxiety medication. He also finds that there is later on going to be some bag, kind of where his legs are, which I guess for the most point, I guess like Ryan didn't find right away. So what? It's like if anything, there was probably just this point in time where Ryan, as soon as he found this phone, like that was the only thing that mattered. And I think a lot of people harping on the fact that it's like, oh, he didn't look around throughout this whole entire coffin. Of course he didn't. Like he just saw the phone and like he thought like him calling people was his saving grace. Hence why like we have like Ryan, who is to kind of be very much, or not Ryan, Paul's character is to be a very much impulse person. And like we don't have like we do have at some point where Paul is eventually trying to push against the coffin to try and see if there's any leeway, like kind of bashing from side to side of this coffin to eventually try and see if he could kind of loosen up any of these boards, which he can't. So there's a lot of people that I guess probably thought like, well, like Ryan didn't do a good enough job trying to see if he could escape this coffin. There was a lot of points in time where Ryan was to be like pushing against this coffin, and like he was trying to eventually try and do some kind of things. Ryan, in this little bag that we find later, ends up having a knife in it, ends up having a green light in it, and so it also ends up having this paper that supposedly Paul is supposed to read, of which that he cannot. So eventually what ends up happening is that Paul is to eventually go lose his signal with this FBI agent. And so now Ryan is desperately trying to figure out what part of the coffin does have a signal. So then when he gets to that perfect spot, Ryan is to kind of like jump down or push his body down to eventually be able to call somebody. Which, here's the goofy thing. So we end up having that one spot where eventually the phone is to lose signal for then him to, for the rest of the movie, like just be seemingly fine, just kind of being where he is. Because I guess there's like a good enough signal, like technically where he is at some point. So, so now Ryan is to eventually go and get a call from this terrorist. And so, and I'm going to be all over the place. I'll admit that like this movie isn't going to be tailored and done perfectly, because there's just a lot of just random phone calls that keep coming in from time to time, or there's random things that Paul does at some point in this movie. So the terrorist is to call Paul's character and is to mention that that Paul's embassy should give the terrorist $5 million for Paul, and Paul's like, no one's gonna pay $5 million for me. Like, I'm not a politician. I'm not a like, I'm no one. I'm not Lady Gaga kind of thing. So the terrorist is like, well, we'll take less. We'll take $1 million. So it drops from $5 million to $1 million, but the deadline is by 9 o'clock. So we also have Paul, who is to seemingly have another driver that is to be in this same scenario as Paul, but she is just to be held by these people in this seemingly building where Pamela is to have to do videos and all kinds of things to try to get her freedom. So eventually Paul is to now call I believe a girl named Donna, because I guess she's a relative of his, because he can't get a hold of his wife. He ends up calling his wife Linda and leaving her a message, and it's like, hey, I'm buried down here. like like I need your help. Like, get back to me as soon as possible. And it really seems like Linda doesn't get back to him until the very end of all this, because we also don't know time zones. We don't know any number of things that are to kind of go on here, which would factor in for Paul really having complications of getting a hold of any number of these people. So Paul eventually is to call Donna, and so we have, of course, first where Paul is calling Donna, and they end up getting into this aggressive, aggressive argument, and to where Paul is desperately pleading to Donna, it's like, just give me the number, just give me the goddamn number. And so eventually Paul hangs up the phone with this girl, and then he is just be smacking again against the coffin. And so he ends up going and recalling her, and the girl's like, what? And then Paul is to reiterate and create his calm, and is to tell Donna, hey, I'm buried alive, I'm going to die here, please just give me the number. Because I don't have the number with me. I lost the phone number to contact my company. I know that you would probably have this number somewhere, so please give it to me so I can call my company, so I can eventually let them know what is going on. And so this girl's like, okay, all right. So she ends up giving him the number, and he writes it down, and he's like, okay, goodbye, bitch, or something like that. And he freaking hangs up because he's so ticked. And why wouldn't he be? There's so many people that put him on hold, and there's so many people that there's so many problems that he's having to tell them his life story, because they don't believe a word he's saying, because of course there's so many times where there's prank calls and whatever being done, but they should easily be able to trace this call, which supposedly they can't, to be able to find out whether this guy is to be legitimate or not. So eventually Paul is to go and call this RTC CRT company. RTC, what is this, the Navy? CRT. So Paul ends up calling the CRT and gets a hold of some operator, which all of a sudden transitions. This one puts him on hold, and he's like, don't put me on hold. To eventually to have him speak to some CRT spokesman, which eventually like just kind of leads to Paul having again to tell someone else his life story as if he hasn't already. And so eventually uh it seems that these CRT people are to kind of know what is going on with this whole scenario, because I think Pamela had released out this video about what's going on with her. And so now that these people, this company, is now aware of this situation and knowing possibly that someone had gone public with this, I think they're eventually going to slowly but quickly come up with, or slowly but quickly. That's a weird, goofy thing to say. Surely but quickly, come up with some kind of scenario in their mind to resolve this. Yeah, resolve this. And so eventually this company is to just be like, well, luckily we have a person that we can transfer you over to, that is to be over in Iraq, that is to kind of be able to deal with this kind of like kind of thing. So supposedly this is to be a guy named Dan Brennan, who you'll kind of see him kind of tying himself along with Paul through a bulk of this movie. So, and they say like, well, hey, like we can like put you on hold and transfer you over. And so Paul's like, sure, like go ahead. So now Paul has to again tell his whole life story to Dan about what had happened. And so Dan is like, okay, like, and so Paul is to have been called by the terrorists, and so he ends up telling Dan that. And Dan is to tell Paul, it's like, well, hey, like, wait as long as you can humanly possibly stand it to before you make this video. Like, we desperately, like, every single time his company or Dan or anybody is trying to force Paul to avoid doing anything that will alert the media whatsoever to bottleneck this thing. And I'm like, wow. Because even Paul at some point is to threaten this to his company. Just like, hey man, what if I go onto the news right now and I talk to anybody? Will this get this resolved quicker? Like, will this, will this get a rush job at like me going and being saved here? Like, come on, like this is taking forever. And so, uh, and they're like, whatever you do, don't talk to the media. And it's like, of course, because you don't want your company to be put in a bad light. So Paul is to talk to Dan, and so whatever you do, like refuse to do this video, don't do it. So all of a sudden, Paul is to be waiting a long stretch of time to get back to Dan, but Dan is to be the only one that is really tell Paul like what he can do to kind of like adjust his phone to, instead of having be on like on vibrate, it ends up being on a ringtone, so it supposedly saves the battery, and so on and so forth. Like Dan is kind of really helping Paul out. Weirdly, Robert Pattinson, which like to me, weirdly enough, doesn't sound like Robert Pattinson on this phone call, but I guess it is, weirdly enough. Like, that's so weird to have Robert Pattinson's voice being done in this movie. It would be kind of interesting to have seen Robert Pattinson like talk about this film, but I guess it's like you would just have a bunch of random people eventually lending their voice to this movie. So I bet they probably wouldn't have actually really like cared about like what they did, but it was probably just hey, Ryan Reynolds film, heck yeah, sign me up. Definitely I'll go and do a Ryan Reynolds film, because who wouldn't? So you got freaking Jacksepticeye and Free Guy going and doing, as well as a number of other YouTubers going and doing Free Guy and being involved in that. So uh anyways, so Paul eventually is to go on and is to eventually forcibly go and do this video because we had the terrorist was like, you do video, and he's like, no, like I'm not gonna do video, and they're like, you do video, and like we had the first conversation where like the terrorist was to call like Paul a soldier, and he's like, dude, I'm just a trucker, like I'm nobody, like I'm nobody to you. And so they're like, well, like you're American, right? And Paul is like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, you're technically a soldier. And he's like, no. like so like there was that whole disagreement. And so eventually Paul is to be forced to seemingly do this video because he is to also have uh like kind of pictures and all kinds of like videos and all kinds of stuff being sent showcasing Paula, who is to have been kind of tied up and whatever. So eventually Paul, who is to be kind of sympathetic with Pamela's kind of situation, he is to have wanted to help her out by hoping that maybe uh, if he does a video, he'll go free. Because it seems that Paul is to demand to these terrorists, like, hey, if I do video, I'll go free, right? And they're like, but we need money. Like, get your embassy to like give us money. And so, and we really have some people that are to just to like say that they can like persuade these terrorists to eventually just say, "Oh yeah, I have a friend at the embassy. He'll give you $5 million if you just set me free." I like if I were to have been anybody, I wouldn't have believed that story for the life of me. Um, hey, I know somebody that's going to give me $5 million. Where can I wire transfer this to you? So you're gonna let me free, right? I have the information of the wire transfer on me right now. Like you have to unbury me to. So, anyways, so like we could come up, we can go at this all day. So eventually we have Dan. We eventually have Paul eventually making this video, and so eventually Dan is to find out that Paul had made the video, and so. Uh, Dan is calling Paul is like, why did you make the video? And Paul is like, because you guys aren't doing anything. You guys haven't found me yet. Uh, and Dan is like, hey, like we're trying. We're trying to get to you. We're trying to trace your phone. Evidently, it has some weird Egyptian ghost, weird goofy signal thing that we can't easily find, but we're trying. So eventually, Paul is to want some insurance about that maybe this has happened to someone else, and then eventually Dan had found them, and so Dan had mentioned this Mark White guy, and so Paul is like, "Oh, tell me the life story of Mr. White or whatever his name was, like Mark White," and so. Dan was like, "Oh well, yeah, like he was a student and he came over here and he ended up getting buried alive and we found him." And so Paul is like, "Oh, that's reassuring." Like, but he ends up like putting the name and like scratching it into a box, just saying that like, "Yeah, I don't know about this guy. Maybe they're making up this story." So, but like, uh, for this, like, Paul is to seemingly be reassured. So all of a sudden, now we end up having a number of things happen here. So Paul is to eventually find out that seemingly a snake had made it into his coffin. Either the snake was planted in there by the villainous people, or the snake somehow or another slithered its way in. So now Paul is to go and kind of spill some of his canteen with alcohol in it to splash onto the snake, and then seemingly after that go and toss this match to eventually light up this snake. And so the snake ends up running off into the side of this hole of this coffin, where Paul is to eventually take this little bandana and kind of fill this little hole. And so eventually Paul is to have to scramble to eventually kind of take this whole like fire out, but not only that, he has to kind of switch uh, to a certain part of this coffin because I think he ends up dropping his phone. towards the bottom of this coffin. So like he has to go and grab for the phone. So eventually there is also to be a part of this movie where Paul is to start hearing certain kind of ruckuses going on, certain kind of thuds going on, and Paul is to also say that he hears some kind of music of sorts. And so Dan is like, okay, so you must not be that heavily underground. So there might be a chance we may be able to find you. So we end up having supposedly F-18s or something like going and doing a flyby to supposedly go and wipe out these villainous characters. I'm like, well, what about Paul being buried alive? Like, all their concern is to be wiping out the villainous characters, and they don't really give about the actual person who is still buried alive. Really? Like, okay. So here's where it comes down to the worst part, because we end up having at one point Paul, like, we're heading to the worst part. So Paul eventually is to try and call his mother, who is to be Mary Ann Conroy, and so he ends up trying to call her, and of course it seems that his mother must have some kind of memory problems or something like that. And we have Paul, who's trying to like talk to his mother, and his mother is just repeating over and over again that her and her father, or her and Paul's father, had been playing bridge all this week, and like that's all that Paul could really get out of his mother. Like, even asking her to just say, like, well, could you just say that you love me? And so she ends up repeating, like, me and your father have been having bridge and all. I'm like, and he's just like, okay, all right, well, I guess I'm not going to get anything out of you. So, so eventually he ends up calling Linda, and again, just gets straight up nothing. So, because he just wants to eventually just go and hear like the answering machine to just kind of hear something from his family, because he might die before he even gets a phone call or anything. So now, since all of a sudden that whole like the whole F-18s kind of go through and kind of wipe out this area, all of a sudden we are to have certain cracks in this coffin that are all of a sudden to happen. There are certain dirt that is starting to come into this coffin. This coffin is to crack. Some of this dirt is to start to weigh into this coffin, so on, so forth. So here's also the interesting thing. If Paul would have decided at this point now to try and unbury himself and to try to get out of this coffin, and try, since now most of the coffin is to seemingly be cracking anyways, if Paul would have probably decided to go and escape out of this coffin, how much further would have Paul desperately needed to have gotten out of the place of which that he is to be buried alive at, because we now don't have a clue of any kind of debris that is now to be on top of Paul's burial place. Like, all of a sudden Paul could have tried to dig himself out to eventually find that he is to have been seemingly still under piles and piles of rubble, to where he could have never quite possibly gotten out of. Plus, he probably would have lost air, even if he was to have like put like some kind of like shirt or pair of pants or something over his face, to have supposedly given him a certain kind of supply of air. So Paul is now to talk to Dan, and so Dan is to say, it's like, oh, well, like the F-18s kind of went by and were to take out the villainous characters, and so like, hey, like, There might be a problem still finding where Paul is to be buried because there's no one to really be there to really showcase where Paul is. So, but we end up finding out that the villainous characters are still alive because they end up going and having a video to send Paul that is to showcase that Pamela is to be now shot in the head. And I'm still kind of building up that big horrific moment that I kind of mentioned before. We still haven't gotten there yet. I'm still getting there. So Pamela is now shot. Paul is to now desperately go and do a video where he is to cut himself, to cut his finger, to hope that this video would eventually lead to his freedom. And he ends up sending that video out. So Dan is to mention evidently how many views that Paul's video has actually gotten, and that it is technically gone viral. And so now all of a sudden, while Paul is to seemingly get some sand and dirt and whatever being tossed into his coffin, we end up having Alan Davenport, who calls Paul's character, and here's where it really is to be the big, massive, heartbreaking moment that I was alluding to so often. Let's get to it. So Alan is to go and talk to Paul and just be like, well, hey, like, I want to confirm that I'm talking to Paul Conroy and that you're employed in this company and so on and so forth. And Paul is like, yeah. What is all this? I'm just trying to reconfirm all this information. So now Alan is to now like record this whole message between him and Paul. And so Paul is like, what are you doing? Why are you recording this thing? Like, what are you doing here? And so Alan is to mention that that supposedly Paul was to have been relieved of his job by this morning before this incident even happened, because supposedly Paul was being accused of fraternizing with his coworker Pamela, and that Paul was to be relieved of his job before this incident was to happen. It's like, well, shouldn't he have gotten called that morning? Shouldn't he have been told he was fired before he even went out to do this job? Like, they are just kind of saving their backside to basically just try to avoid any kind of real legitimate damage that is to be coming from this moment, or anything that is to follow XYZ certain things after this. And I think this company had always this in their back pocket every single time this moment was to arise. Just be like, well, okay, like if anyone is to say anything, like, we're just gonna have this thing to just say, oh, well, I think he was probably like fraternizing with this one girl, so we let him go that day. I kind of wonder if right out of the gate that maybe that's the reason why they had a male and female driver there. So immediately they always had this in their back pocket to like just have some kind of weird paper trail to have had by this company. Plus, how would this company have known? Like, how would there have been files that had already been reported? Like, this just seems like the most like kind of weirdest kind of swerve that a company could do. But anyways, so Paul all of a sudden is to find out, because if anything, also for a lot of companies, like, there is to be a huge mound of paper trail before they are to really do anything for like firing anybody or whatever. And plus, also with a company that is to be like a company that's to not be present and to not witness anything, how would they in turn realize that there is to be this kind of relationship brewing between these two people for whatever, like, but like companies can just fire anybody because they sneeze the wrong way and just report that. Just like, I don't know, he's being he's being uneasy to work with because he sneezed, whatever. So, and like they could document that weirdly. So, so Paul is to have basically asked this company. It's like, well, like my insurance is going to cover my death, right? like, like I'm going to be able to give my family and this like my money for when eventually I die, much more so than what I have on me. And so like, yeah, about that. And like, wow. And Paul's like, wow. So you're not going to cover anything that's going to happen during this whole situation. And they're like, well, no, we're just going to pull the ripcord because like we're basically going to like falsely document all kinds of things to eventually figure out how to not be able to like just say that we could wash our hands with this because Paul had went to the media. Paul had done a YouTube video, and that was media enough. Because eventually the media had took this video and put it on to the news, and so all of a sudden the company was as quickly as possible coming up with false documentation to wash their hands of this, so Paul would just be on his own. So, and plus also like the like Paul doesn't exactly mention what company he's involved in. I don't think in the video, so like anybody could have just washed their hands with this and whatever. Uh, but anyways, so Paul is to just be like, you put me here, like you're a piece of and like, and so Alan is just like, I'm sorry, like there's nothing I can do. Like I have this company telling me I need to do this, so like I'm just a messenger. like, but that doesn't like Paul is to start to lose hope and like yeah, like I probably in this scenario, I probably would not have left it up to having my life be in the balance of someone else's hands, especially once the dirt of this coffin was to start to emerge in here. I would have specifically gone on and just be like, okay, well, I need to figure out a way to get out of this coffin because I'm going to die. There isn't a wait and see anymore. Like this has been taken far too long. Um, Even though yeah, Paul had to kind of do like a round robin phone situation to eventually try and like figure out how like who he is to talk to and what is the quickest way to get to people and so on and so forth. So uh, to kind of quickly get to eventually wrapping this up. So Dan is who was supposedly had gotten to Paul, and like I hope that I've kind of covered a bulk of this movie so far. I think that I kind of have, maybe. So eventually, Paul, and we also had that one spot where like Paul is to just be like sitting in the coffin, and we end up having this like zoom out scenario thing where like the wood pieces just getting longer and longer and longer and stretched out to just kind of see that Paul is never seemingly going to like get out of here. It gives us that kind of visual of just like Paul is never going to figure out a way to get out of where he is. He's just so far away from people and whoever. So Dan is to now call Paul and just be like, "Hey, like we found somebody that can lead us to where you're buried." And Paul is like, "Great, hurry up and get me out of here. The air is so thin." And so eventually Paul is to just kind of take certain parts of things that he had kind of put into the wood pieces that were broken and to eventually start to let sand come in because he's thinking that he's going to get rescued. And so that was, of course, a mistake because like Paul was just so wanting to just get the heck out of here so desperately. So Dan was supposedly digging out Ryan's character, Paul, and Paul is just to eventually start having sand and dirt and whatever coming into his coffin. And so Paul is like, hey, hurry up, desperately get me out of here. Like, I don't hear you. Where are you? And so Dan is to say, like, we're so close, we're so close. And so all of a sudden, we eventually have Dan open up this coffin to eventually find out that it's Mark White and it's not Paul. So now all the sand and all the dirt and all the whatever is coming into Paul's coffin. And so Paul is just to basically have to realize that he's dead. Like he's going to die. All this dirt and sand is going to come into his coffin. He's going to completely lose air. He's going to die. And so Dan is like, oh no, like, I'm sorry, Paul, we can't find you. So Paul's dead. Paul is effed. With that said, that's the ending of the movie. And I'm just like, God, like, I honestly wish that there would have been a rescuing part. I wish that there would have been a saving grace part of this movie. But when you really look at horror movies, there's sometimes when the hero lives at the end, and then of course there's times when heroes die at the end. So really watching this movie and just enjoying the eventual progression that this movie goes into, and not to strategically think of and notch down every single second, and to just kind of break it down to just like, here's the mistakes that Paul made. It's like we have a very direct, or just kind of like really just scared person. And like I think also people forget about that fear factor, how much fear is to be placed in. Like Paul is to kind of quickly give up hope a lot, and to eventually just be like, hey, no one's coming for me. Like, I'm going to die, right? So I think Paul comes from this place where he obviously is going to right away think he's going to die instead of being saved. So Paul probably doesn't think about how he can escape this coffin, because he's probably thinking at any point in time, if he's probably to escape, he's probably going to die. If he's probably going to not be able to quickly have someone rescue him, he's probably going to die. He's probably going to think about the amount of air of which that he is going to eventually not have if he is to try to burrow his way out of this coffin. And plus also, here's also the thing. We don't even know, like, if there was to be metal bars or anything like that surrounding this coffin. Like, I think people have to realize how durable this coffin could have been. Um, there could have been any number of things where, like, it seems all good and simple that Ryan could have possibly gotten out of this coffin, but probably not. If people didn't want this guy to have gotten out of this coffin, they would have come up with some kind of strategy, some kind of trap, or some kind of something that would lead Ryan to eventually die easily, or Paul's character to easily die. Um, but I just wanted to overthink things to just eventually have it be that trying to unbury yourself is not an easy task. But then also, like, some people would have come up with their own strategy to try to think of a way to eventually get out of this scenario. Because we have, I think, at some point had this happen eventually at some point in time. Like, I think even Scream, the one MTV movie, eventually had somebody buried alive at some point. And so, yeah, like, everybody is to eventually have this kind of movie, show, something like that done. But again, it's always horrific to eventually be the worst possible scenario that you could possibly be in is being buried alive. Like, that is probably the worst death you can possibly have, because it's a slow process. Plus, it's also like basically like you are to probably have less than nothing as far as resources to figure your way out of here. Like, Ryan even having a knife in this scenario is like really just surprising. And we probably could have had Ryan with this simply knife, could have possibly eventually had us figure out some way of him getting out of here. Ryan eventually going and taking this one loose nail to try and untie his ties that he was to have on his hands was kind of a very interesting maneuver, because when we open up with Orion, he's to be gagged and he's to be tied up. So, with that said, I think that's all I want to say about this movie. Hopefully, I covered everything or most of it, but I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.